Let's get into it. Kyle Kulinski now hates Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, as you guys all know, I have showed you every step of the way when it came to Joe Rogan waking up and seeing the light that is Trump, to not only having him on the podcast like we all wanted, but actually endorsing him just a week before the election went down, giving Trump just that little nudge that he needed. We're all very thankful for it, but Kyle is not. Kyle's very upset that Joe did that, and he is completely turned on him. And Kyle says he's going to war with Joe Rogan. That's like me saying that I'm going to war with Joe Rogan. What are you talking about? Kyle Kulinski has been on the Joe Rogan podcast like 5 times. His wife has been on the podcast, and when Breaking Points first started, that his wife is on with Sagar, Joe Rogan said he would help them out. And Joe's known to be a very generous person, so I can only imagine what that actually meant. And it wasn't just them being on the show, because they were on the show when he said it. So who knows how he actually helped them out, but Kyle doesn't care about any of that. I'm going to show you Kyle when he was on the show, and then I'm going to show you the madness that he has devolved into because of TDS and now Joe Rogan hate. Let's get into it.
Especially when you know there's clear evidence it's manipulated by money.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the idea that a bad idea should be suppressed versus a bad idea should be refuted by better ideas. That's really the essence of debate, and that's how we come to an understanding of what's real and what's not.
And I'm sorry, but a lot of people are just lazy. Like, I don't think CNN is good at debunking ideas that they dislike. I don't think they're good at it. And so I think it's sort of like a cheap shortcut to be like, oh, just sort of jerry-rig the algorithm a little bit and let's get rid of that. Yeah. You know what I mean? And it's just lazy. People who actually care about the stuff, who care about the facts and the information, you need to be able to spread it to new people and debunk things that are incorrect. And look, it's hard, right? Because a lot of people, if you go down a conspiracy rabbit hole and you really believe it, you know all these little data points and things you could pull out and say, well, what about this? And it's hard, but you know what? Doesn't matter. You still got to get in there. You got to have the debate. You got to have the conversation. Yeah. And sometimes you'll win, sometimes you'll lose, but you got to engage in that because it's the only way you're going to change people. One of my favorite things, when I go to these, like the Politicon events like they used to have, people would come up to me and tell me like, I want to thank you because you took me out of going down a very bad path. And that always felt so rewarding to me. Because, you know, I treat people like they're people. Yes. And somebody might be going down a bad path and going down that pipeline where they like some alt-right troll or whatever. Yeah. And then it's like, you know what? I watched you. I thought you were fair in how you debunked it. And you won me over. And that's the way to do it. That's the only way to do it.
There's also people that feel alienated, right? And then there's a group that sort of accepts them. And so then they become captured by their audience or captured by the group that they're a part of. And then they say things and lean towards things that this group accepts.
That's exactly right. There's a lot more that goes into this. It's just general human psychology that is overlooked.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like if you treat people like people and you meet them where they are and you say, one of the biggest things is going, hey, you know what? I think on that one you have a point. That's a good point right there.
It's very,
this
very
other
important.
thing, here's where I disagree on this other thing. Let's talk it out, right? And that makes people go, oh, at least you're honest, right? Like, it's funny. I've always had like a love-hate relationship with libertarians because I love them, they love me on certain issues. When it comes to civil liberties, when it comes to war, I love this Kyle guy, man. He's right about everything. But then when we get to economics, they totally disagree with me, and they're hardcore, ardent capitalists, and I'm over here advocating for social democracy.
Ayn Rand.
Yeah, but it's fair and it's good and it's fun because we'll agree where we agree, we disagree where we disagree, and let's see what happens. And so as long as you keep that dialogue going, I guess the only caveat here is when you're dealing with like a quote-unquote bad actor. You know what I mean? Somebody who doesn't even believe what they're saying, but they're just saying it. That's a little different because then it's like, well, how do you deal with somebody who they're not even having a real conversation?
Yes.
You know? So that's harder when you deal with that. But I generally...
Don't you think that the more people there are like you, the more stuff like that becomes transparent?
I think so. I like to think so. Yeah.
I think so for discerning people. And that's my dilemma about conspiracy theories and nonsense, is that I do know that some people get sucked into the QAnon stuff and all the wacky shit, but I don't. So if I don't, why are you telling, like, if I don't get sucked into flat earth, and I think it's funny if I watch a video, who are we protecting? And why are we protecting them in that manner where we're suppressing something that doesn't affect people who are discerning and intelligent?
Yeah.
Like we're infantilizing people in a certain way. We're protecting them because you're not smart enough to recognize that this is nonsense. Or you're not diligent enough to look at the possibility that it's nonsense and look at the alternative perspectives and the arguments against it.
Yeah. And look, I mean, some percentage of the population, yes, they're gonna end up wherever they're going to end.
I like that part of the clip. I let it run a little long. I just wanted you to hear Kyle saying you have to debate and you have to win people over, and that's the way to do it. I do that with libertarians, and we have a good back and forth, and then they help me dye my hair, and we have a sleepover and a slumber party. That's he said that, right? I'm pretty sure that's a direct quote. But Kyle feels this way no more. Decided to attack Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is fake independent media, barely a comedian anymore, and he's morphed into state media for Trump. He's more like Rush Limbaugh than George Carlin. I get compared to Rush Limbaugh all the time. Is that an insult? Damn. I like it. I don't know. That's just me. And this is when he heard about Joe hinting that he's going to be doing his podcast at Mar-a-Lago, which we all talked about, and I was very happy about, actually. But now, this is where Kyle's at with it when he's talking about Joe Rogan. Not quite talking about debating and winning people over anymore. He's kind of a little different now that he hasn't been on Joe Rogan's show in a little while.
Then you're fake independent media. You're not real independent media. And I'm now going to war because what we saw is a lot of these people like Joe Rogan, you know, I was there. I was on his show 4 or 5 times. He would sit there and nod in agreement when I would make anti-Trump arguments and arguments in favor of a left-wing worldview. Then 3 weeks later, Ben Shapiro would come on and say the exact opposite of me on every issue, and he would nod along in agreement, right? And so at some point, you got to call a spade a spade. You're not independent media, and you're clearly just a vibes-based voter, right? You cocooned yourself in this right-wing echo chamber where you got right-leaning UFC people and right-leaning comedians, and Dana White, his boss, is super right-wing and loves MAGA. He put himself in this echo chamber, helped to break his brain, and then look at that. He goes full MAGA. And you know what? That makes me look like a jackass because I was the one going in there, taking him at face value, acting kind, holding his hand and walking him through it like he was a toddler on these topics. And then, wow, in retrospect, would you look at that? You completely flipped. I mean, we were defending him, unfortunately, way too late, right? When people were already on to, I don't know, man, you're saying a little bit more right-wing things here. And we would be like, well, no, look, here's a compilation of all the times Joe Rogan said base things. He argued for universal health care. He argued for free college. He argued for higher minimum wage and this good thing and that. And I would show that compilation and go, see, I don't know what you guys are talking about. But guess what? When you decide I'm going to endorse Donald Trump after he lied to your face relentlessly for the entire podcast, telling brazen lies, then I'm sorry, all the charity is gone, all the sympathy is gone, and I have to come to a different conclusion now. My conclusion of you could hold these people's hands and walk them through it and talk to them like they're reasonable and work it out. It just didn't work. It just didn't work. And that's why you see a much more bold, aggressive style out of me where I'm like, F these people and the horse they rode in on, because if what I did before didn't work, okay, I got to try a different approach now. So if it's just call these people the frauds they are, well, then guess what? We're going to call them the frauds that they are.
But don't be like hard on yourself in that way.
I don't want to hear what she has to say. This is all just about Kyle here and everything that he's going through. This is major JDS. You've heard of TDS, but have you seen JDS? Joe Derangement Syndrome. Very interesting to see here. Now, very opposite from what he was saying in the clip. He's talking about debating, all of that. But now that Joe ends up landing somewhere else. See, that's the thing with the left. They're all about communicating and talking, and let's talk it out. Let's get that whole thing going. And the second you're like, you know what? I'm actually going to land over here. They're like, oh, you're one of those guys. Oh, I didn't realize you were a Nazi. I didn't realize you were a racist. Did you? I just didn't realize you were like Joseph Stalin. Oh, you tricked me. You shaved your mustache. I thought you were Joseph Stalin. That's exactly where they go with it. Didn't realize you were misogynistic. You know what? I actually dug up some things that you did back in your past, and apparently you held your girlfriend's hand for 20 minutes and she didn't really want to. I didn't know you were a predator. They go through the whole thing. And Kyle's just at the beginning. What do I got on Joe? What can I say about Joe? Actually talking. Now think about that clip that I just showed you. He's saying that he was walking Joe through things like a toddler. It sounded like two people having a conversation. And in fact, when I saw this episode of Kyle and Joe on JRE, it seemed like Joe was walking Kyle through everything. And he was guiding him around. and letting him say what he thought. And then he has a problem because he's like, oh, and then he has Ben Shapiro on and ends up agreeing with him. Well, that's what Joe does. He agrees with people from both sides. That's what ticks me off sometimes. That's what ticks everybody off sometimes. That's what gets some people calling him a fence sitter. But what he's actually doing is he actually has a broad range of thought, and he can agree with Kyle, and he can agree with Ben Shapiro. And he's always been like that. That's why he had Bernie Sanders on his podcast, and he had Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Elon Musk on his podcast. That's that Andrew Yang for the left. He had a bunch of very left-leaning. Tulsi Gabbard, when she first got on this podcast, she was a Democrat, left-leaning. You were on his podcast, left-leaning. But now all of a sudden, now that all the people from the right started getting on the podcast, now it's a big problem. Now Kyle has a big problem. Again, just a quick little clip of where Kyle used to be with it before and after. Check this out.
All right, so there's a lot I have to say in response to this.
Sorry, let me slow it down. Of course, you guys know me.
Kinds of criticisms from this guy, I honestly believe that these people usually overstate how bad Trump is, and they understate how bad Biden is. Well, you're more ideologically in agreement with Biden than you are in agreement with Trump. Well, actually, when it comes to the First Step Act, I agree with Trump on that. When it comes to pardoning Alice Johnson, I agree with Trump on that. When it comes to TPP, Trump's against it, Biden's for it. I agree with Trump on that. I agree more with Trump on North Korea than I agree with Biden.
A few years later.
And then, like, for you to go from Bernie in 2016 or 2020, I think 2020, and then go to Donald Trump in 2024, I don't buy this idea of like, oh, we should all be the Joe Rogan whisperer and like be really nice to him to try to get him back to our side. No, f that. I was the guy who, before anybody else was even paying attention, I was holding his hand and walking him through it slowly and explaining it to him like he was a child.
Come on,
and he
Joe.
would nod along in
Joe,
agreement.
come on, buddy. Come on, don't be scared. Come on.
And then, you know, when I'm gone, then Ben Shapiro comes on a couple weeks later and he nods along in agreement to Ben Shapiro. And Steven Crowder comes on and he nods along in agreement with Steven Crowder. And then this comes on and that comes on. So the bottom line is he's a contradictory character. And he'll vibe with mostly 95% of the time, he'll vibe with whoever he's sitting across from. But there is no ideological core. At the end of the day, when somebody is that contradictory, what it comes down to for Joe, how he makes voting decisions, is vibes. And I am waging war on vibes-based voters because it's not tenable and it's not serious. So with Trump in particular, he likes the vibe. I think he's anti-establishment. I think he's anti-elite. I think he's anti-corruption and pro-worker and anti-war. Literally every single one of those things is verifiably untrue, and it doesn't take long to debunk it. And there's zero paying attention to the extremism of Trump, the extremism of Republicans. Now he's cocooned himself in a right-wing echo chamber. I don't know if you saw this, but recently he said he's going to go to Mar-a-Lago to do some podcasts, and Trump may pop in every now and then. And it's like, could you imagine if a comedian was like, I'm going to go hang out with Joe Biden at his vacation house in Delaware on Rehoboth Beach, and maybe he'll pop in every now and then. He would get roasted. Everybody would say that guy is a f***ing hack, not a comedian, not funny, loser, snuggling up to power. So that's why I said he's more like Rush Limbaugh than George Carlin.
Boy, man, that is so ridiculous. How many comedians were with Kamala Harris when she was on SNL? Or when they had that correspondence dinner and there was, again, another comedian from SNL doing the roast. How many celebrities cozied up to Kamala Harris? How many cozied up to Joe Biden? How many said that they were going to vote? How many went out of their way to call Republicans and people who wanted to vote for Trump things like being dumb and stupid and this and that? How many? How many? And you didn't see the comedy community never turned on them. Trevor Noah, the comedy community never turned on Trevor Noah. The comedy community never turned on Jon Stewart. What are we talking about here? This is absolute derangement that you're seeing here, ladies and gentlemen. It's ridiculous. You almost made me swear. It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. All because he didn't agree. That, again, that is the leftist way. They will act like, oh, I'm just in the middle. Yeah, we're just trying to hash out some ideas. And the second you decide, you know what, your ideas are wrong, they completely turn on you. Completely turn on you. You know, at least, and Malcolm X talked about this. Malcolm X talked about this so long ago. He would say, be wary of liberals because they're showing their teeth, but they make it look like a smile when they're showing their teeth. He would say the Republicans, at least you knew what Republicans wanted. They understood. They'd be like, I want to take care of my own. I want to make sure America's fine. They would just be straight up. You should pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I did. My father did. You should do the same. I feel like that's how it should be. They were very open. And obviously this is all rhetoric from back in his time, you know, Malcolm X time. But that made him comfortable. That made him feel okay because at least they were being upfront. You know? That's what I try to do. I try to be very upfront with you guys. I'm not playing around like Kyle. If Joe Rogan decided to interview Kamala Harris, I would be like, this is terrible, but I would still be covering Joe Rogan. You know? It's just so crazy that he took this line of thinking, talking about, you know, taking him by the hand and all of this nonsense. Like anyone cares what Kyle Kulinski has to say. Joe was doing Kyle a favor. He was doing Kyle a favor by having him on the show. He's acting like as if he's this huge political entity. He's acting like he's Tucker Carlson. You don't even do the news as well as your wife. And you're talking smack about Joe Rogan? You're a podcaster and you're supposed to be a political person. You're definitely not as funny as me. I'm just going to pat myself on the back here. You're definitely not as funny as me. Okay? Hair's ridiculous. Suit looks ridiculous. Married to Crystal Ball. Love is love. That's fine. It's just that she's like a mainstream media shill type of person. You know? But I guess that fits well with him. It's just ridiculous in my opinion. Here, listen to this.
Really all over the place politically. You know, depending on the day, depending on who he's talking to, he'll give you something that is at a far right field and far left field. But every now and then, you know, his normie instinct, that's who he is. He's Joe Rogan. He's like the average Joe, minus the fact that he's a gazillionaire, of course. But like his normie instinct will kick in and it'll piss off all of the right-wingers in his audience and some right-wing commentators.
And we're drinking Bud Light, so
See, so he knows, and listen, he's about to show when Joe Rogan drinks a Bud Light and he says, oh man, Bud Light's not the problem. It's ridiculous that you guys are doing this to Bud Light. And a lot of people were upset with him. But that just shows that he is somebody who could see both sides of things. And Kyle, at some point, he used to claim that he was one of those guys. He was like, he was a guy who could probably be seen as left of center, center left, whatever you want to call it. But now look at him, like a cult member. It's absolutely ridiculous. And he has frosted tips. I mean, I think that's the most damning evidence about this gentleman is that he has frosted tips. This is ridiculous. And it says a lot about that crystal ball to allow her husband to leave the house with frosted tips. I'm just saying. People who are letting them do videos with that type of hair, they're not his friends. It's not okay. I'm just saying. You know, when you're bald, you think a lot about hair. You're like, oh, if I had some hair, I'd be like Jason Momoa. I'd have my hair. Oh. You think about it when you're bald. Just a little bit. And one thing we in the bald community do not think about are frosted tips. That is ridiculous. Absolutely disgusting behavior from Kyle Kulinski. But I just wanted to bring you guys that. Just showing you guys how much Kyle has. One more thing, just exemplifying my point perfectly.
Then you have, you know, the podcast landscape, the somewhat comedy-oriented, but also political-oriented. You got the Joe Rogans, you got the PBD podcast, you got the Trigonometry podcast and stuff like that. And look, you got to call a spade a spade. A lot of these outlets sort of portray themselves as, no, we're just real, reasonable people having reasonable conversations. And we're like centristy and stuff, bro. We're not like ideologues, bro. But at the end of the day, they may call themselves centrists or moderates, but They just end up effectively helping Trump and the right wing.
And that's the problem. He just admitted it himself. What's the problem with that? What's the problem with people looking at both sides and being like, this guy over here seems like he's for the country. This lady over here and her whole deep state puppetry, that doesn't seem like something I want. And I'm going to go with this guy. That's exactly what America's about. And for some reason, it's always these leftists that have a huge problem with what America's about. They have a huge problem with people just having choice. They have a huge problem with people just thinking for themselves and not going with your idea set. They always seem to have a gigantic problem with that. And they usually end up being socialists. Quote me on that. Look into it. Anyway, guys, I just wanted to bring that up because I found it absolutely ridiculous. This guy truly bit the hand that feeds him. Joe Rogan made it so this guy actually hit 1 million on YouTube. He actually made it so his wife's show could do well and his audience could actually go towards that show. He did a lot for Kyle and his family. And for him to turn around and do this simply because Joe made a different choice than what he thinks Joe should have done, garbage. Garbage bag human. Anyways, guys, like, subscribe, turn on the notifications, helps the channel tremendously. And other than that, I'm out.